Prusa Firmware 5.1.0 is out, it's stable, and you need to go upgrade to it right now. Hello everyone, Chris here. Yes, Prusa has a new firmware out, 5.1.0, and if you have one of the newer style Prusa machines with the 32-bit board, like the Mini, the XL, or the Mark IV, you're going to want to update to it. Because right out of the box, you're going to get a lot more features. So many that I can't go into them all in one video. Today, I've decided to focus on speed. Now, with this new stable release, they're going to implement input shaper and the correct model for linear advance to be able to achieve a lot of speed on their existing hardware. So for something like the Mini that we're going to be using here today, I've had it for several years. Just by updating the firmware, I'm going to get a huge performance bump. And that's pretty good considering I paid less than $400 for this several years ago, and now it's going to be almost like a brand new machine with how much speed that you're going to gain. And that's pretty impressive, so I thought it'd be worth making a video. So let's take a look at the Mini real quick. It's a little workhorse machine. Nowadays it's just a little over 400 bucks, but still a really solid printer. The Prusa Mini is a great entry-level machine. In fact, if you can deal with the smaller build volume, 180 cubed, you can use this in farm situations no problem at all. Mine's got some serious city miles on it. I've done thousands of prints with it over the years, and I've never had to do any maintenance, and I've never had any issues. Of course, your mileage may vary. Not every printer is going to be exactly the same, but this one has been very solid. I've even dropped it off the shelf once and broke some parts, and I never really repaired it much outside of reattaching the screen. The thing that I usually say about Prusa printers when people are looking for printers to buy is when you purchase one, you join the Prusa ecosystem. That includes Prusa Slicer, their materials, their printers, and all of their support. All of that aligned together, they have an end-to-end process that just makes life easier. A lot of people will say the price is too expensive to get into the Prusa system, but with all of the advantages that you have, especially as a new user, it's well worth the money. And of course, all of this is just my opinion, but I have used over 100 different 3D printers over the years. I've bought many Prusa machines with my own funds just because of that reliability factor. And because they're able to support things end to end from the slicer all the way to the material, they can help you sort out problems if they do come up. And it's a fairly quick process. So I've always had good luck with them, and when you see things like this, where they're updating firmware even years later for these machines that make them even better, that's always fun to take a look at and introduce and show others. Because you can take the machine for what it is now and turn it into almost something else. And that's pretty exciting. So that's what we're going to do today. On to the fun stuff. So this is Prusa Slicer 2.7. Now this goes hand in hand with the new firmware 5.1.0, where they've introduced input shaper, as well as a lot of different features. But you're going to want to use this going forward with your prints. But it's also compatible with any other firmware, just as it is today. So what we're going to do to start out is just slice a benchy with our original Prusa Mini profile in the new slicer and see how it turns out. Do note the version that I'm running on my Mini right now, we're at 4.4.1. On the newer versions of firmware and Prusa Slicer, they have gone to binary G-code. That greatly reduces the size of the file, as well as helps them interpret it. Now they've done several things inside the G-code. We could go through all of that. We'll touch on a bit of it later. But since we're on the old version, we want to make sure we're using stock G-code, not binary quite yet. It's very easy to switch back, but all the profiles have been updated. They're assuming you're using the newest version of firmware. But to turn it off, it's real easy. Just go to Print Settings, go down to Output Options, and untick Export as Binary G-code. Now we can slice it and export it as a .g-code file, just as we always did. And the purpose of this run on the older firmware is so we have a good before and after of the results you're going to see. Your Mini might be good now, but we want to see what it's going to be like after the update. So let's take a run on the old firmware. So on the old school firmware, the Benchy took an hour and 10 minutes. I have done hundreds of these over the years. That's a pretty typical print time that we're used to seeing. Now remember, the Prusa Mini has a Bowden extruder setup. So it has a little bit longer retract, so that is going to add to print time and create some artifacts on the print that a direct drive printer would not. But now let's go ahead and jump to the firmware update, and then after that's complete, we'll take another print, and then we'll compare them side by side. Now, on to the upgrade. So the first thing we're going to do is head to the Prusa site. We'll go to Help, and then you can go Printer Model, and we'll select our Mini, and we'll download 5.1.0. From here, if you'd like more information about what they've upgraded in 5.1.0, you can go to More Info. There's lots of great info here on the GitHub page. They provide graphs, what the differences would be with different files, all the different features. Remember, it's for multiple printers, so there's a lot of info. Now, one thing to note when updating to this version, if you're not on 4.4.1 already on your Mini, you're going to have to update that first and then go to 5.1.0. It's not a problem, but if you're on an older version, you will have to do that. From here, we're already at GitHub. This is the easiest way to grab that version if you don't have it. Just jump back here to Releases, and you might have to navigate to a couple of different pages, or you can use the Find feature, but in here you're going to find 4.4.1. This is the release that you'll want right here, but we want to get to this version before we jump to 5.1, just because that's the stopping point. So we have to be at least this current to do the final upgrade, which I am, so now we can jump to 5.1. We already have the download, so we can just right-click Extract All. We have all the different languages for the BBF file. They're all in English, so pick your favorite secondary language. We'll go with Czech. We'll right-click and copy. And then we'll put it on our Prusa Mini flash drive. Once it's on the flash drive, we'll just load it on the printer. And the easiest way to kick this off is to just hit reset. It's going to find that new version of firmware and ask you if you'd like to flash. Just hit flash. It only takes a couple minutes. It's going to go through several screens and reboot. It has to update the bootloader as well. You'll get back to the main screen. If you have the Wi-Fi module, it'll let you continue with that. And it'll have new firmware for it as well. So you can go ahead and flash that if you want to. Flashing the Wi-Fi successful, we can go ahead and continue. And just for a check, we can go back to Info, check out version info one more time, and we're now on 5.1.0. So now we're going to head back to Prusa Slicer and we're going to slice our Benchy once again. But now that we're on 5.1, we can use Input Shaper. And there's going to be an option for your Mini printer with Input Shaper. We're back to stock profiles. Remember, we changed over to regular G-code from binary G-code. That was in print settings over here. But this time, we're going to use the binary G-code. It's much more efficient, and you can flip back and forth in between the two if you'd ever like to. But we'll go ahead and slice again. And let's go ahead and test our model now with Input Shaper enabled on the new firmware. So updating the firmware on these machines is very easy to do. Now that we have our before and after update prints done, let's take a closer look. So here we go. This one here is the old school firmware without Input Shaper. This one is Input Shaper and all of the new goodies that you get. Now the first thing you're going to notice is a lot of the different artifacts, but you can see some stringing here. Remember, this is a really up close look. The stringing is just a few wisps there where it does the retract, but It's not bad at all, but pretty typical for a Bowden style machine. Also, remember, most of my filament is set out, so it's going to have more stringing. There might be a little moisture involved, but it's PLA, so this is about what you're going to get for this style of printer. What we're really interested in is what has improved on the print, because we do have less print time here, so it should actually be a little less quality, but with Input Shaper and the firmware being tuned, it's actually a little better. But there are trade-offs. The first thing that you should notice if you have Input Shaper, the biggest thing it's trying to reduce is the ringing. This is non-Input Shaper here. You can see the ringing here. That's typical on the Benchy. It's not present on this one. So it has alleviated some of that echoing, or ringing as we call it. The stringing amount is about the same, but with that linear advanced enabled, you can see some of the layers and how it did them differently. Here it looks a little bit sparse when it's jumping to different artifacts on the Benchy, like that windowsill. Here you can see that it's tried to compensate for it. The layer's just a little bit thicker. It's most noticeable on the smokestack here. It's a little misformed. It's able to get all that filament straightened up with the Input Shaper and Linear Advance enabled. Since this is PLA, we'll definitely talk about part cooling. Again, no Input Shaper enabled. The cooling is a little better, I would say. The overhang is better without Input Shaper because it's not moving as quickly. It has more time to cool off the filament. The Mini's cooling fan isn't as drastic as some of the other models are, so you can kind of compare those side by side. But just look how much cleaner the layer stacking is on the Input Shaping one versus the non. It's just a much cleaner print, a lot more accurate. You also notice that the non-Input Shaper is just a little shinier than the Input Shaper one. Again, that's because of the speed. The hotter the filament is when it lays down, especially with PLA, the shinier it's going to be. Moving quickly, like this on the Input Shaper side, it's not going to be as warm when it actually puts it down on the bed. Something you might want to consider or compensate for depending on the part that you're printing. Again, on this side, you can see some of the artifacts over here without Input Shaper. Most of them are cleaned up over here on Input Shaper. And from the back side, again, you'll notice that smokestack like we saw before. Most of the artifacts are the same. You can see some of the seams over here where it lays them down are quite a bit sharper over here on the new firmware version. So you definitely see improvement after the upgrade. So this is pretty much a no-brainer here. If you have one of these Prusa machines, you need to just go ahead and update that firmware. It's increased the quality of the print, and we knocked 20 minutes off our print time for the Benchy. And that's going to be a lot different for different models. The Benchy's not necessarily the best case, but we're used to looking at those, so that's what we did today. So be focused on some of the things that you're going to see, though, if you're printing faster or with Input Shaper, like that sheen on the material. You might not have as sturdy a print if you're printing faster because the filament doesn't go down at the same temperature when it's moving at speed. So keep all of that in mind, but you can definitely see the improvement just by updating that code. So now let's go ahead and jump into the slicer and talk about a few other things that you'll see improvements on if you go to 5.1.0. So we're going to use the console model here to talk about some of the features in Prusa Slicer. Again, a lot of these are going to appear in other videos, but I did want to touch on a few for a second so you'll know what's coming up. Now the first thing we need to talk about is ARC support. This is something we've been needing for a long time in the slicer, and it's here. But what is it? So let's just go ahead and slice this model. Now by default with 2.7 Prusa Slicer, it has ARC enabled on several of the printer models. You can confirm that if you go to Print Settings, and if you go to Advanced, you have this setting called ARC Fitting. Now, what it enables is G2 and G3. Now, G-code traditionally is just G1 commands. It only goes in straight lines, X and Y axes. If you take a look at the raw G-code, traditionally all the radiuses that you would do, anything that you have to go in a circle, would just be a bunch of tiny G1 commands to try to get you around that radius. Now you can see G2 and G3 commands sprinkled in here. This allows the printer to actually make a complete arc movement. G2 is clockwise, G3 is counterclockwise, I believed, or vice versa. Doesn't really matter, but that's what you're seeing here. It's a true radius movement rather than a bunch of lefts and rights, ups and downs mixed in to make your radius. Maybe not ups and downs, lefts and rights, but you get it. X and Y movements. So just for fun, we're looking at the raw G code. There's 887,000 lines to this file. If we were to go to print settings, back to advanced, and turn off arc fitting, and slice again, we've opened that new G code that we've sliced. The file is now over 1 million lines. 1,091,000 and some change. So just by adding those arc movements, we've been able to squish this file. So it's easier to process. And arc fitting is something that we've been dealing with for a long time. There are plugins for Octoprint like Welder and Meat Packer that do this type of thing, but now it's built into the slicer, and if the firmware can handle G2 and G3 movements, which most can nowadays, it's going to make that file a lot smaller and easier to process. Also easier to process because it's smaller through whatever you're connected to. With Prusa, it would be Prusa Link and Prusa Connect, and that has also been improved on their machines with this new firmware. Finally, in Prusa Connect, this is a feature that I've been waiting for a while. I've mentioned it on several videos, but if we go and add a printer, we can now select the Mini. So now I can add my Mini along with all of my other machines, if you have it plugged in Ethernet or Wi-Fi, of course, so that I can see them all at one time and see what they're doing. And all we need to do to add it is go to Settings, go down to Network, go to Prusa Connect, make sure you're on the Wi-Fi, of course, you have to set that up, or Ethernet. We'll enable it, and then add printer to connect. You'll get a screen with a QR code and a code that you can punch in on Prusa Connect. I'm just doing this so that you can't see the code, and it makes the editing job a lot easier. You're welcome. Punch in your code and then name your printer. And after you click Add, in a couple of seconds, you're going to have your Mini online in here in Connect. You can see the temperatures, what it's set at, and now you can utilize it just like all the other machines here in the interface. I've been waiting for this a while, super excited about it, but it does work really well. Now I can monitor it from all one screen. And this video is really focused on speed, not all of the new features. We're going to talk about that in later videos. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out my profiles here to make sure that we have stock settings. And remember, we're on the default Mini profile here, not the one with Input Shaper. And different models are going to utilize Input Shaper differently. So if we slice without Input Shaper for our Castle friend here, our estimated print time is around 10 hours and 5 minutes. But what if we utilize the Input Shaper profile? We'll click over. All the same settings. We're just going to slice again. We've shaved 4 hours off of this print. Not bad. And the more intricate, the more difficult the print might be, the more time you should be able to save. And remember, we saw that print quality. You shouldn't have to sacrifice anything. And we might as well use our Prusa Connect now that it's up and running and give this print a try. By the way, when you upload files to Prusa Connect now, you don't have to necessarily wait for them to complete the upload. You can start them ahead of time and it will continue to upload while the print's already printing. Another nice to have feature. So there you go, a brand new Prusa firmware you can load on your machine really easily. That's going to give you better print quality, reduce your print times greatly, and give you more speed. And it's all for free. It's great to see these companies, they're releasing new machines with their firmware, as well as the older machines get that same bump. It really has changed how I use the Mini. And it might do the same thing for you. In fact, you might want another one after you see the performance that you're going to get with this new release. And a lot of people are going to say, none of this is new. Input Shaper, Linear Advance, all the things that they're doing. And it's not. But it's always good to see a really good deployment on a machine that's been around for a while. So, hopefully you found this helpful. That is it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one. Let's take a look at the time-lapse.